It's great to welcome to the program Sean McFate, who is Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and also author most recently of The New Rules of War, Victory in the Age of Durable Disaster. Sean, it's so great to have you back.
Great to be back with you, Dave.
So we've been following a lot of different geopolitical and also sort of military related stories. We had what looked like it was heading in the direction of a big escalation with Iran that did not happen. We've been talking about the possible different paths that the future of the three big superpowers, the US, China, and Russia, could potentially take. And in that context, talking about technology, militaries, China's declining birth rate, and all of these different factors that could play a role. If you just were to big picture for us the changes that we've seen to the dynamics of the superpowers over the last couple of years under Donald Trump, what has changed, I guess, is maybe where to start.
Well, the first thing is that Donald Trump is really doubling down on the defense budget. The U.S. military budget is bigger than the next seven biggest militaries in the world combined. It's sort of like the Ronald Reagan buildup. And I think in some ways, and there's a shift away from terrorism to great power competition like Russia and China, Iran. And in some ways, that's smart. But what's not smart is what we're investing in and how we think we're going to fight those wars if it becomes a war.
Can you give some examples of that in the sense that, I mean, I think we've talked about how whenever there is a discussion of a possible war now, our minds probably still go to the type of warfare of times past, and that's not realistically what it would look like. But what would it look like? What would the sort of battle lines be?
So in the old rules of war, the way you won war is battlefield victory. Think of Waterloo, Gettysburg, Stalingrad, Midway. But when was the last time battlefield victory swayed a war in the last 70 years? No times. So warfare has changed. We think in terms of conventional war. We think that the future war is going to be like World War II with better technology. But in fact, where war has gone to is strategic deception. And what matters now is wars became epistemological. So what matters now is not like battlefield victory. It matters what people and populations think. So what does victory look like now? Well, let me ask you a question. I mean, like right now we're engaged in a cultural war in the United States of America, right? Fox versus CNN, Democrats versus Republicans, all those things. Now we know that democracies are messy, and it's okay if we're having an organic family dispute. What's not okay is if foreign powers are finding the fissures in our society and fanning those flames deliberately. And that's indeed what's going on. It's a form of warfare. It's not something that F-35s can fight.
Is it so I understand what you're saying. I still though, so let me give you a counterexample and see where you think it fits in. In the
Yeah.
discussion of a possible escalation with Iran, we saw some pretty good pieces that said, from a strategy and tactics perspective, Iran will be very different than Iraq. Iran's military is much stronger than Iraq's. The land, the sort of geographical realities of Iran are very different than Iraq, mountainous and very different. Those seem like analyses more related to the sort of traditional battlefield, and they seem relevant. Are they partially relevant? Are they relevant in a different way? Or is that not even a reasonable analysis to be making?
It's not a reasonable analysis at all.
Really?
I mean, no. I mean, to invade Iran would be like to invade China or to invade Moscow. You know, both Napoleon and the Nazis learned not to invade Russia. Just because you have more troops and more bullets does not mean you're going to win wars. So what's going on? And let's look at Iran. What's going on in Iran right now? Well, we know that Iran and Russia in the last 10 years have really come to dominate Middle East politics. We kind of lost, and Russia is filling the void, and so is Iran. And the way they're fighting is not like the Iraq-Iran war of days of old. They're using secret type of weapons, they're using a Quds special forces, Hezbollah, terrorist proxy groups, propaganda, all these things. And you know what? So does Russia. They use Spetsnaz, they use mercenaries like the Wagner Group, they use Little Green Men, they use these fake proxy militias, they use propaganda and active measures. That's how they took the Crimea, right? And this is also how Iran has taken the Levant, how they've taken Syria. And they're doing it not through troops on the ground and tanks and mountainous, they're doing it through deception. And the reason is that we live in an information age where weapons that give you plausible deniability, like terrorists and special forces and propaganda, weapons that give you plausible deniability are more potent than firepower. We in the US are still focusing on firepower, but warfare has completely changed. Iran and Russia fight this way. We do not.
So let's keep talking about firepower a little bit then. Nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
A lot of the conversation around Iran stemmed from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which, as far as we knew at the time that Donald Trump decided to bail on it, Iran was abiding by. Of course, since then, Iran has now said, well, if the U.S. is out, we're not going to abide by it anymore. Can you talk a little bit about, in the new sort of framework of what war would look like, what role do nuclear weapons have? Because often the conversation is merely about, if the U.S. gets to have them, who are we to say Iran doesn't? The legitimacy of the UN Security Council. That's often the conversation. I got a caller a couple of weeks ago who said, David, what's not being discussed is it's possible that Iran getting nuclear weapons could be a moderating influence, in the sense that sometimes once countries have nuclear weapons, they see themselves as part of a sort of different tier or echelon, and it can actually tone down radical rhetoric. What do you think about that? Where do you come down on the role of nuclear weapons in new warfare?
It's a great question. First of all, the JCPOA is on hospice care. It's done. And we also know that Russia is working behind the scenes of the UN to let the arms embargo on Iran expire, so that come October we can see, Iran and Russia really doubling down on conventional weapons. In terms of nuclear weapons, WMD, it's probably inevitable that Iran at some point will get a nuclear weapon. We can bomb Natanz with we'll take a nuclear weapon, maybe a JDAM to hit it. That will slow it down. We could also try to assassinate their scientists, as Israel has done. That can slow it down. But I think we have to be prepared to live in a world that may have a nuclear Iran. And if they do, we have to ask ourselves, are they really going to deploy it? I mean, everybody assumes they're going to deploy it, and I don't know if that's true. People said this about North Korea before North Korea became nuclear. And in fact, once Iran is a nuclear power, we still have levers of power, levers of diplomacy we can pull on them. It's not Armageddon, despite their fierce rhetoric. I'm not being an apologist for Iran, but there are people who treat it like the moment they get a nuclear weapon is the moment, Tel Aviv and New York City go up in a mushroom cloud. And I think some of that is just fear mongering.
Well, there's no question that the use of a nuclear weapon would be self-destructive. There's no question about that. But I guess the broader question is, when it comes to policy, would the presence of or the more serious potential to have a nuclear weapon make that country perceived as more important to negotiate with? I mean, there are examples from history. We can look at Iran. We can look at, within the Soviet Union, instances where there has been disarming, where there have been agreements to disarm, that the future has not gone particularly well for some of those countries. So if you look at history, it's understandable why countries would see nuclear weapons, or at least the serious potential of them, as a good negotiating tool or something that's good to have.
That's right. I mean, look at North Korea. They were treated as a B-list player at best before they got nuclear weapons. Now people pay attention to them when they speak, and they're not going to give up on nuclear weapons despite whatever the Trump administration promises. Look at Ukraine. They gave up their nuclear weapons after the Soviet Union collapsed. The United States promised them, oh, we'll protect you if Russia ever gets aggressive. And then when Russia got aggressive in 2014, the U.S. broke its promise. So I think the entire world knows that it's better to have nuclear weapons than not, and it shouldn't just go to the victors of the World War II. I think the danger is a nuclear World War I Sarajevo moment. If Iran ever gets a nuclear weapon, we know Israel has nuclear weapons, and many believe that Saudi Arabia has a secret deal with Pakistan. Saudi Arabia used to have a nuclear program in the 70s, 80s, and the U.S. They talked them out of it. But some believe that Saudis made a secret deal with Pakistan, giving them all their research and all their money, and said, "You develop nuclear weapons, and if we ever need one, we'll just secretly buy a dozen from you." And so very quickly we could have a nuclear Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and there's a threat of accidental war, like a 1914 Sarajevo moment, but it doesn't last four years. It lasts 30 minutes, and that would be tragic.
What do you see as the role of organizations like the United Nations? We've talked about NATO a lot since Donald Trump has been president, and shared defense treaties. There's this streak of both. I mean, it starts with nationalism, but it often leads to a sort of isolationism in some cases. What do you see as the role of multinational organizations, joint defense treaties, et cetera, in the next 10 to 15 years?
It's a great question. I mean, first of all, the question about NATO is long overdue, and Donald Trump's not the first person to ask what's their mission, right? That's hardly new. I do think that international organizations like the United Nations have passed their expiration date. They have failed to evolve with the world. Right now, we're in a world where it's not the world that we imagine. The world diplomats imagine is state-centric. States are everything, and everything that's not state is called sub-state politics. But we live in a world where the Fortune 500 are more powerful than most states, where the super, uber, duper rich, the 0.1% globally, are more powerful than the most states, and where mercenaries are back. So anybody who's rich enough can go to war for any reason they want. That means anybody can swipe a paycheck, can become a superpower eventually. ExxonMobil gets its own army. Bill Gates gets his own army. Mega churches, oligarchs, they all get their own militaries. So the UN is still stuck in the state-centric worldview. And they're not likely to leave that. And so is international law, which is why they become less and less relevant for mitigating and managing conflicts around the world, whether that's Rwanda or the Congo or Iraq or Afghanistan. At most, they're just a rubber stamp. They're stationary at most. And I think they either have to evolve, or they're just going to become lip service.
What would the evolution of an organization like NATO look like?
Of NATO, I think that NATO is. I think NATO's past its expiration date, because after the Cold War, it stopped becoming a military alliance, became a pro-democracy alliance, and now it's kind of run half by diplomatic think and half by military think. If there's going to be a real alliance, a collective security alliance, look at what Poland is doing on the east. So Eastern Europe, they take Russia's threat very seriously, and they're kind of forming an informal security cooperation pact. And I think something like that might be more of a model. But it needs to be, NATO would have to be once and again seized with defense as its primary mission, and not being used as a tool for human rights and democracy. As important as those things are, that's not the original nature of a defense alliance.
We've been speaking with Sean McFate, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, also author most recently of the book, The New Rules of War, Victory in the Age of Durable Disaster. Sean, so great having you on today.
Thank you, Dave. It's great to be back on your show.